All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay, hi everyone. Can you hear me still? Hopefully, good. My name is Nancy Sheppard. I am a nonfiction author and historian. And I was sitting here, I wrote down notes. I'm like, talk about your qualifications, but I don't know how to talk about that without sounding arrogant. I've been a nonfiction author for, well, it'll be 4 years since my first book came out, and I have my fourth one coming out next month. Um, I hold a degree in history, and I'm midway through my master's degree in American history, and I've been nominated for the Virginia Literary Award 3 times. So I wouldn't exactly call myself a subject matter expert, so I put this together for you based on my own experience of writing and publishing this wonderful genre. So first, we're going to start talking about what's nonfiction history, and this is where we're going to talk about the difference between fictional history and nonfiction history. Nonfiction is basically it's a literary work that talks about real events with real people that really happened, and as opposed to like fictional history or historical fiction, which takes a more of a well, a fictional view of a historical event by placing a character or something that may have not existed into that situation. So today we're going to focus on the nonfiction aspect of it. So it combines this ethically driven research, and we're going to talk more about that in a second, but using a quality literary voice in order to convey a lens or a perspective of history. So it's how do we get people to read the genre that a lot of people may not enjoy necessarily? So the first key before you even start writing is you have to find your story. So I'm going to take you back in time to about 2010. So I hadn't finished college yet. I was a stay-at-home mom of 2 kids. My husband was active duty in the military, and I was writing these stories of local history on for a defunct platform called Yahoo Voices. And I stumbled across this picture on Sargent Memorial Collections of North Public Library's digital archive. And I saw a picture of this airship and I was completely engrossed in it. And needless to say, that moment changed the trajectory of the rest of my career and in many ways my life. So you have to find something that catches your interest. If you're not at all interested in whatever you're writing about, the reader's going to know and you're going to lack passion in your voice. And so the key is always making sure you're exuding the passion for what you're writing about. And that is across the board for any genre that you write in. I know Cassandra was talking, I was reading her poetry, and you could just hear the passion in her voice while she was reading those pieces to us. And so that is the key is you have to be passionate. You have to enjoy what you're researching because it's a long, tedious process. And there are many places you can find it. I mean, you can find it anywhere. Drive around, look at the historical markers, look through your family genealogy, do what I did and search through digital photograph archives, anything that can catch your interest. If you're watching a documentary and you hear something cool, write it down and research it and then run with it. That's the huge key to the beginning of it all. All right, so in history, we call perspective a lens. Um, because we are a topic that has been around since, well, the beginning of history, bad historian joke there, you have many sections or many subjects that are overly written about. So what you have to do is find a unique perspective. I was very lucky with my first book, which is, I actually have it next to me, um, this one, because there were no other books out about it. So I was very, very lucky, but that's a rare instance. So you have to find what's a unique angle you could take it. So I put down on this slide an example of the Revolutionary War. So say you're interested in writing a book about the Revolutionary War. Yeah, it wouldn't be probably in your best interest just to write a big survey, start to finish Revolutionary War, because there are so many books out there about the Revolutionary War. So the key would be what is a unique perspective? Um, for instance, do you want to talk about women's roles in the Revolutionary War? Do you want to talk about specific people? Going back to the women example, Deborah Sampson, who dressed as a man to fight in the war. Or do you want to talk about a particular battle? Or from like the French perspective, but a particular angle will also help you narrow down your research because there is, again, so much historiography out there on certain subjects that it could be overwhelming to piece apart what you need, what you don't need, what hasn't been used before. The big thing is you have to know your audience and your competition. This is very hard when you're a first time writer because you may not necessarily know who exactly will be reading your book. Um, and so it takes a moment to kind of figure that all out. And you can be very vague or very specific. For me, I like to write for the person who does not like to read history. So I try to write more of a narrative storytelling form instead of the very dry, what history is known for, the king's battle dates, very bland statistics, and no human interest. You have to learn about what people like to read and how they like to read it. Do they like the narrative? So you're telling it from the perspective, like Dave McCullough's John Adams is a perfect example of this. So he basically writes from the third person of John Adams' perspective. Or do they like a more academic voice? So say you're writing a research paper and it has to be very factual and lacking in that empathetic notions. And does your reader like to look at a lot of pictures or not? For me, I love putting pictures and imagery into a book because I feel that makes a better connection for the reader so they can actually see in their minds and imagine the situation and so on and so forth. Again, this could be difficult, but I recommend going to Amazon, Goodreads, walk around your local bookstores, and look for, the books in your subject area. And also take note to look for smaller, maybe lesser known books about the subject. So if you go on Amazon, don't necessarily look at who is your first 10, go to page number 27 and see what books are there and kind of get an idea of what is already out there. Now, you also have to get an idea of who your competition is in terms of who else has written about it. So you need to look at their gaps in research. Where do you think there needs to be more development in the story? What is not yet out there that you can provide? So we're going back to our Revolutionary War example. So you would go look up authors like David McCullough again, Bernard Bailyn, Stephen Budiansky, and you see what they're writing. And then you go and find those authors that may have not been as well known. And you just read through their books. And on top of that, you're getting great information, usually from these ethically driven sources for research. Now, no matter what genre you are writing in, most or many authors like to do an outline. I have to admit, in my first book, I was not good at this. I just I tend to be very ADD in my writing process and research process. And so I would have notes like scrawled on the side of pamphlets and things like that. It made absolutely no sense. Needless to say, it created a lot of extra work for me that wasn't necessary. And so every author has a different manner in which they outline. I actually brought out the research binder I have for my third book, Lost Attractions in Hampton Roads, and to show you kind of what I do. And what may work for me may not work for you. So what I do now, after a lot of trial and error, is I put together tabs on the side, and these are my homemade tabs about what every subject is about, because that particular book, there's a different subject in every chapter. And then what I do is I take my notes and I plug them into a Word document as I'm researching. And as you can see here, and then what I do is I add what the note is and then what my citation is. And we'll talk more about that in a second. And that way I always have where my research came from, what the research was, and I put it in a chronological order to help me be more organized. But you got to think of it as kind of like an organized brain dump in terms of what you want to do. So when you're starting to outline, just ask yourself, what is the question I plan on answering with my book? So again, we're going to go back to our Revolutionary War example, and you can write down at the top, the question I plan on answering is in this book is discussing the role of women during the Revolutionary War. So you have that in mind before you even get started. Now, when you're starting your outline, you need to understand that your outline is fluid. You're not making a concrete contract with yourself that this is the way it's going to look in my final manuscript. This is the way it's going to be. Research is very unpredictable. You may find something and veer completely to left field that you've off of your roadmap that you made for yourself and that you want to add. So you've got to make sure you allow fluidity and flexibility in your outlining process. So we're going to talk about one of my favorite parts of this entire process, which is the researching. This can be very tedious, and it also can be really enlightening. So when you have to research for this history-driven nonfiction piece, it's always important to use resources that are considered valid in research. Um, so we're going to discuss exactly what this means in a little bit. Actually, coming up next. You have to look for verified primary source documents. If you don't know what those are things like letters, contemporary to the period newspaper articles. So say you're researching World War II and looking at newspaper articles from 1943. Um, Death certificates. We're very lucky if you're researching the state of Virginia that death certificates up to, I believe, 2014 have been digitized. And if you have a ancestry.com membership, you can look at death certificates. And that really helps you get to know a little bit about that finality of a person's life. Journals that were written, for instance, looking at an article in a journal that was written in 1922 about Roma, my first book subject. Hanger logs, looking at interviews of people who are actually participating in these subjects. These are all valid sources, but what you have to keep in mind is any sort of bias that may have existed at that time. So you can't really place a 21st century perspective on how someone was perceiving something in the period you're looking at. So there's a lot of personal bias and a little unknown because they didn't have the advantage of afterthought like we do now. And then you have to look at secondary source documents, which are modern scholarly journal articles, which you can find those up on like JSTOR, Google Scholar, um, peer-reviewed books. These are academic books that were written and published by publishers that have someone in the field read through it to verify the factuality of it all. Different theses that have been published online. These are all different valid secondary sources. I also have used in the past going to say the websites for if I'm researching like my second book, Murder and Mayhem. There's a chapter about the cannibalism that happened at Jamestown. So I went through like the articles that are posted through the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation's website because that they are the resource for that, if that makes any sense. You have to remember what I call the rule of two. Any sort of facts you present and citations have to be irrefutable within the historiography that currently exists. So what you should always do is look and verify that from a different source that that fact is indeed a fact. So you go and you read a thesis going back to the Revolutionary War, talking about Deborah Sampson was a woman who dressed as a man to serve in the American Revolution. Okay, so now you've got to go and find another resource that is valid that verifies that. So that way you have that cover your own tail thing happening. Now you can't use unverified sources. What I mean by that is things like Wikipedia, blogs that are written by people who are not subject matter experts in this subject. And you can't verify that, or websites that are not tied to the professional organizations or agencies. This kind of goes into the entire fake news thing that is a popular phrase now, but you have to make sure that your resources are something that are tied to actual legitimate fact and scholarly research. So Wikipedia is not considered one, though I know it's popular and we all fall down the Wikipedia rabbit hole. It's not considered valid because anyone can write on Wikipedia. I know I've made edits on Wikipedia myself. And so that way you don't know whether or not you're getting something that is factual. Blogs that are not written by a subject matter expert, while they're great to get ideas of something to research, you can't cite that, so on and so forth. So write down everything regarding your information. In history, we use a format called Chicago Turabian. And so if you want your piece to be considered valid in the historical community, you have to use that type of formatting. So we'll talk more about that in a second. So everything that is not considered common knowledge needs to be cited. So for instance, going to Jamestown. Jamestown was founded in 1607. That's common knowledge. But if you're talking about the starving time and you're talking about, say, and I forgive me if I get a little macabre here, it's what we call in our community graves humor. Um, you're talking about a man who was executed for killing his wife during the starving time. That is something that needs to be cited. And by cited, meaning it gives you an address for how people will know to look up where you got your resources from. So you have to familiarize yourself with this format and become comfortable with it. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But I would highly recommend, if you haven't already, picking up a copy of a couple of books. So we have the Chicago Manual of Style, and then Kate L. Turabian, who is one of my heroes. I love her. Her manual for style. And in these books, it will tell you the way you format basically any resource you can think of. And then when I do my outlining, I like to insert my research quotes into my outline because that helps me know that I'm not misconstruing what the research may be. So where do you find your resources? So as we've talked about with valid research resources, we need to also think about where you're going to find them. And this is a very broad construct. The internet has made it so accessible to look at all sorts of resources from all over the world. So there are websites like ancestry.com, Full3, newspapers.com that are excellent resources. In fact, I have found newspapers.com and Ancestry to be completely invaluable in my research because you're looking at all these amazing primary source documents. And by ancestry, I don't mean looking at someone's family tree, but looking at the digitized resources like the death certificates, like the passenger logs and things like that. So you can get these right in front of you. Scholarly databases like JSTOR, ProQuest, Google Scholar, those are places where you can find your thesis, you can find your journals, you can find published pieces that have been put into the historiography of a subject. Museums and libraries are invaluable. I can't begin to tell you how wonderful Sargent Memorial Collection at Slover at North Public Library has been for me and my work. They are a fantastic resource in terms of newspapers, imagery, yearbooks, anything you can think of. They have this massive, massive database online and in person. Once everything is open up again, that they are worth a visit, even if you're not writing about the subject. Also, Hampton History Museum over here, where I live on the peninsula, another absolutely invaluable resource in terms of the amount of materials they have in their archives. So let's see, where was I? The thing is, though, with these, I recommend going in person, learning this from experience. A lot of museums, they may not have the budget or the time or the staff to be able to digitize items that aren't already digitized. So it's always good to contact them in advance, set up an appointment, and they might be able to pull the materials you might want to look for. I always recommend that if they need things digitized that haven't been digitized yet, offer to do it for them. And we'll talk more about that in a second when we talk about your toolkit that you'll need. And then government agencies are wonderful, like National Archives, Library of Congress, various Department of Defense agencies. Because while they have a lot of stuff online, again, that's another resource that it's always good if you can to go to the source to get materials because they have an unbelievable wealth of information. And then you have to think a little bit outside the box. Like, for instance, you're researching Revolutionary War. Again, we're talking about that. And you don't think of places like, oh, let me go to the little museum in the basement of York Hall in downtown Yorktown, see what they may have. So you have to think about places that may not necessarily be so conventional or be the first thing you think about. when you do this. So what do I need when I go researching? Okay, so this is where we're going to start talking about materials. Um, so I always recommend having a good pair of archivist gloves. You'll have to forgive the ones I'm about to show you because I've had them for a few years and they are pretty grotesque looking now, but these are them. These are soft white cotton gloves. You can get them off of Amazon.com in packs for pretty cheap. And the reason why you need these is because when you're handling artifacts, photographs, anything, you don't want to let the acids and oils in your skin transfer onto that because it could damage the items. So what these do is allow you to hold them and hold them in a manner where they can't get scratched. Again, no oils, no grease, nothing that may be on your hands onto that item. And it's always good to have them with you because they may not necessarily have them at the source you're going to. And I also recommend having a good portable scanner. Now, a portable scanner is like this one here. And I forgot to leave the cable in, but it's one that you can just plug into your computer with a USB port and you can take it with you. Places like National Archives, that's the only type of scanner they'll let you bring, is one that has the ability to be portable. And especially if you're scanning images or whatever, you're going to need that instead of asking your host to do it for you. You also have to have plenty of pencils and note paper. I know I personally prefer to write in pen, but when you're, again, handling artifacts, photographs, things like that, you're going to not want ink that could get transferred over to that item. It could be a catastrophe. A laptop is a must as well. And I say this because especially if you're like me and you take notes on your computer, it's good to have that there so you can just keep plugging and playing into your notes as you're researching. My desk in my office is actually rather intense looking, where I have 4 screens and 3 computers that I use while researching. So that way I can always make sure I have my notes in, but I'm looking at different things I may be running with. Um, Also, a thumb drive, there are times where they may have something scanned for you, or they may have some materials for you, and that way you can plug it into their system, put it on that thumb drive, and you can take it home with you. Also, a good quality camera isn't a necessity, but I do recommend it. This way, for me, I'm a very visual person. I take my camera pretty much everywhere I go. And so if I see something that catches my interest, I can go ahead and I can snap the picture of that. Or if you're also one of these people, I call myself a method researcher, meaning I like to go be at the place. I feel what the atmosphere is like. And that way I can kind of get that image there. But it's also helpful when you're going to these museums and they may have artifacts that may not necessarily be photographed yet, and you can offer to do that for them. It's always good, especially if they're letting you use materials for free, to always um, do something to help them back. Um, and then I recommend a smartphone. It's not a necessity, but many of these smartphones, they do have scanner apps on them. But it also is good if you need to set up a Wi-Fi hotspot wherever you may be, so you can look at materials, whatever, online. Okay, so we're going to talk about fact versus opinion research. So it's important to remember that a person's opinion is not an actual fact. This can be kind of hard to decipher sometimes. So a fact is something that is supported by irrefutable evidence. An opinion is simply that, it's an opinion. So an example of a fact would be, like I put on here, on June 14th, 1775, George Washington was appointed the commander of the Continental Army. This is a fact. It's verified by many reliable resources. That's it. But an opinion would be like, George Washington was the best man for the job. And while this may seem to be true, it is an opinion. It's a feeling about something. So if you want to kind of twist that into a fact, it would be something like, John Adams argued George Washington was the best man for the job. While you are presenting that this is John Adams' opinion, it's also a fact that that was his opinion, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So that way you're always presenting that fact there and you have that covered. So like in outlines, every author has a different manner in which they take notes. Like I told you, for my first book, it was just the most disorganized manner of taking notes possible. I would handwrite them everywhere. They were in no particular order, and it added couple months onto my organization of my notes before I start writing the book. So you have to find something that works for you, no matter how you write it. Now you have to make sure that every note that you take is accompanied by your resource. Like I showed you in my outline for my third book, I always put down um, my fact followed by my resource down there. That way I can go ahead and go back and cite that. I tend to write like 2 sentences and then the resource, 2 sentences, then the resource, just to make sure I have that right resource in there. And then you have to write down everything as accurately as possible. So I personally prefer to write down direct quotations and then I can write from that. But I will also write down something like very blunt, like Jamestown was starving time started in 1609, and put the source. Um, and then I personally prefer to write my notes in chronological order because I write my books in chronological order. So that way it's already laid out for me and it's almost like plug and play once I start writing where I put my facts. And again, I highly, 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 highly recommend getting yourself a copy of the Chicago Manual Style. Makes a good bookend. um, and then Kate Turabian's book. These will help you find whatever type of format you need. And there are also great citation generators out there. I have to admit, I am very partial to citefast.com. I have used it for every single one of my books, every paper I've ever written for undergrad and graduate school. But there may not be necessarily the format you need. You may have some sort of weird resource, and then you need to have the book to reference to. And it's also important to go back and double check that these citations were generated correctly. So don't rely on it 100%, but it does create a great convenience for you. And again, I prefer that one. It does not just Chicago, it does APA, it does MLA, but again, history, we use Chicago Turabian. So this slide is just giving you an example of what Chicago looks like. So I based it on my first book, and you have in your bibliography, you're going to have, it's going to look like the top one, and then the second one's going to be like an endnote citation. So at the end of the book, there will be a series of, let's see if I can find it in my book. Yeah, so generally we'll have this, and it'll tell you what the address of what the resource came from. And so that way you can show you know it, whatever. So that's the basic format. If you go to the University of Chicago or really just Google it, you'll often find proper formatting examples. Now, I personally highly recommend using imagery in your books. Again, it gives that personal connection to the story. I'm a very, very, very visual person, and me having that image there, and I'm looking one up right now, which is not why I'm not looking at you, I apologize, is a very powerful thing. Like for my first book, this picture. So kind of gives you that moment, that feel, and it helps really personalize who the people are, what the situation was, etc., that you're writing about. These can include, again, photographs, maps, charts, graphs, drawings, paintings. And you have to make sure it's kind of topical to your lens. It's funny because my fourth book is mostly photographs, actually. It's only about 10,000 words, but it is about 200 pictures about different abandoned places throughout the area. The key is with these, you can't just use any picture. You have to follow copyright law. So you have to make sure you have the rights to use the images. This can be a bit of a bear to do. So you need the owner's explicit permission to use that image in your publication in order to move forward with it. Now, many places like different museums, Getty Images, and newspapers, they will charge you a fee to use the images. These can be upwards in the hundreds of dollars. And so at that point, you need to ask yourself, is the cost of using this image worth what it would contribute to my book? We'll talk about the financial end of being a nonfiction history author in just a second, but you really have to weigh these decisions. And then you have to make sure you have all the proper release forms and whatnot filled out and returned. And then you want to ask the owner of the image how they would like to be credited in the line. So, for instance, certain places like certain museums, Hampton History Museum is a great example, where they will want the name of the museum, and then they will want the number that picture is in their catalog listed on there. And then you always want to give credit in your acknowledgments to any sources who helped you with imagery. I highly recommend this. Okay, so now after all of that, we're going to start writing. The absolute hardest thing when you're writing is getting started. And I think most authors throughout whatever genre will probably concur with that. I have come to the understanding with myself that I will probably throw out at least my first few pages and never use them. But the point is to find your voice within the piece. So figure out where you're going with it, how you get comfortable with telling the subject, finding your momentum, and then you can go back later. But just keep that in mind that it doesn't have to sound perfect from the beginning at all. In fact, I kind of have another rule with myself that if for some part of me doesn't hate my manuscript on the first read through, I probably didn't do it right. I know that sounds very self-deprecating, but it's helpful to go back and be objective that way. You have to understand what writing voice you want to use. So that is basically how your words are going to translate from the paper to the reader. I tend to like to write in the way I think I sound like when I speak. So that way it's more relatable, it's more of a feeling of conversation, and it's more comfortable for the reader, especially those that may not necessarily like to write or read history. And then while for a long time history was something that we only looked at statistics and kings, battles, dates, and very dry, very boring. I like to live with the rule that there is human interest in all this, and that history is about people and the events that affected them, not just the statistics. And that way, again, it's relatable and reachable to your reader. And you should never forget that. You should never feel not passionate about what you're writing, who you're writing about, what they went through, what their lives are like. Um, that is incredibly important. That goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that you have to be passionate about what you're doing. So now it's time to find a publisher. You've started writing and you're ready to go. There are many authors out there who are very, very successful with self-publishing. My friend Jeremy Rodden is a great example of that, where he writes young adult kind of fantasy books, and he does extraordinarily well self-publishing. The thing is with nonfiction history is that we need to be able to stand on our own as a historian. And without that backing of a publisher and the peer review process, it's a lot harder for our peers and our readers to take us seriously. And like I said, I'm not saying anything is wrong with self-publishing. These are called vanity publishers, not because of any negative connotation. It's because what you do is you pay money for them to publish your book. Well, a traditional publisher is you usually do a contract for some sort of royalties or something like that, but you don't pay them a dime yet. So those are the two differences. But again, I would not recommend going self-published route if you want to be taken seriously in the historical community as a historian. Now, when you're putting together a proposal, you have to visit the publisher's website and to find out what their guidelines are, what they're accepting. Like, for instance, there are certain publishers that only accept nonfiction history on at certain times of the year, or they're only looking for specific types of nonfiction history. Like, we're only looking for American aviation history. So you need to see what they're looking for, and then you need to see how they want their submissions to be formatted. Most publishers are very different in terms of the way they want it laid out to go through it. And if there isn't anything about this on the publisher's website, go into their search or go into Google and search acquisitions department or acquisitions editor. This will be a person we're going to talk about more in a second. Now, many major publishers like the HarperCollins, Random House, etc., these are publishers that do not accept unsolicited manuscripts. What I mean by that is that they will not accept a manuscript without an agent talking to them about it first. Now, many literary agents are very hesitant to sign brand new writers who may not have any sort of background in the community of history. So I can't speak on finding a literary agent because I personally don't have one. Um, but what you need to also look for is finding smaller publishing houses that will accept these unsolicited manuscripts. So you, as the author, emails them directly and say, "Hey, I have this idea. This is my proposal. What do you think?" Instead of going through another party to arrange that. My books have been published through Arcadia Publishing, the History Press. My new one will be out through Fonthill Media. These are all ones I've done unsolicited. Um, and also there are a bunch of university publishers that will take unsolicited proposals and ideas. So I don't discount smaller publishing houses. We have an excellent one up in Richmond called Brandy Lane, who are fantastic people. They're small, um, you have a small number of employees, but they give you a lot more personalized attention when you're going that route in terms of bouncing ideas and whatnot. While they may not have distribution of these major publishers, they have that personalized attention. Now, you got to be prepared to receive more rejections than acceptance. And this is true in anything. Um, you will probably receive substantially more rejections than people who want to publish your book, especially if you're on your first time out of the gate. There are many publishers that will send you a very form response, like, it's not what we're looking for at this time. And for the most part, they will not tell you why. And it's not worth the consternation to try to figure it out why. They just may be inundated things at that moment. Um, and then you have to make sure you have written samples prepared for the potential publisher so they can get to know what your writing voice sounds like, and so on and so forth. Okay, so now we're going to put together your proposal. And your proposal will contain information about you, the subject you're writing about, a roadmap of your book, and also a tentative timeline as to when you will have your work completed. I always recommend having a resume prepared alongside written samples. And for these samples, I highly recommend finding pieces or writing pieces that would be within the topic kind of zip code of what your book will be about. So this will allow the author to get to know you as a writer, get to know your understanding of the subject substantially better. You have to provide, again, an outline of your book, and I like to use my rough table of contents and then add annotations underneath every single subject as to what that chapter will be about. So they have an idea, not necessarily just the subject of that chapter, but what's going to happen in there to make sure it's cohesive. Um, again, provide samples of your resources. So in standard Chicago formatting with annotations, so little notes about why that resource is important. And then samples of imagery that you plan on using in your book, but make sure you already have the rights to publish them. And then I would also make sure you include a timeline of when the completed manuscript will be turned in. Depending on the size of your manuscript, potentially, depending on how much research you still need to do, how many images you still need to get the rights for, et cetera, et cetera. I say a good ballpark is 3 to 6 months. Now, 3 months is really, really tight. 6 months is a little bit more realistic depending on the size of your book. I generally will try to do 6 months, but my third book I literally wrote in 6 weeks. Had a little research done before that, but I literally wrote it in 6 weeks. And needless to say, I was at my desk every day writing like crazy. I was writing on Christmas Day, and we opened presents, and then I immediately went to my desk, which I had my husband move into our family room, so I could feel like I was part of everything. So give yourself plenty of time, because if you rush it, it's not going to be up to your standard. It may not be up to the publisher's standard. Um, and don't stray in this proposal from the way the publisher wants the format of the proposal to look. If they see it's not in the format they want, they will not look at it. And then they may have questionnaires that they may want you to fill out, make sure those are ready to go. Okay, so for a first-time author, it can be very difficult to find a publisher to accept your proposal. I was actually very lucky. I was rejected by maybe 10 publishing houses before the history press picked me up. So you have to remember that you are a product and you're creating a product for this publisher. And an unknown product is a risk. So if you have absolutely nothing that has been published before, you have nothing to show for being able to make money for somewhere as as a writer, you are a risk. So you have to have that understanding in mind. You have to sell your publisher on your piece by emphasizing how unique it is. Like I said, for my first book, I was very lucky because it is the only book in publication about this subject. At that time, that was the one thing I think was the clincher for me, that I hadn't finished my undergraduate degree yet. I had only these few articles that were up online. I really didn't have any reason for them to want to sign me, but I had a unique story to take to them. Um, so you have to really emphasize what contributions to historiography this piece would have and why it would be a good product for them. Um, you have to find a way to sell your publisher on you. So why should they take a risk on you? What makes you an expert on the material? What is your educational background? What are your previous publishing credits? And so on and so forth. So that can be kind of tricky. Again, filling out your resume. What would make them want to take that risk on you and have an assurance that you are a good risk to take? Um, so write about anything when you talk about yourself in terms of I've published here before, I have a degree in this, I've worked at X museum, I've been doing genealogy research for 20 years, anything that could make them feel comfortable with you. Another part of selling a publisher on you is you have to emphasize your writing ability and that you will create an engaging and sales generating piece. So this goes back into those samples that you'll have written. And you have to be confident. I know I am not the most self-assured person in the world. And so I always second guess and question things like that. But you have to remember that you are worth the risk. And now you have to make the publisher believe that. Welcome to the worst part, the waiting game. Well, one of the worst parts. So after you submit your proposals, do not stop writing and researching. Just keep going. Publishers will want a manuscript that's between 30,000 and 100,000 words. Now, this isn't just your text body. This includes your dedications, includes your acknowledgments, your endnotes, your every caption in the book, because the page landscape is real estate, and they want to make sure that they kind of balance that cost of publishing the book. So you have to include all of these factors into your word count. My publisher likes to have smaller books. So I think my longest book was about 65,000 words, and I had to edit it down from about 200,000 words. That was not very fun. So I would recommend you have at least a couple of chapters written before you submit your proposal, so you can just keep going and going and going on whatever timeline you're on. And then you need to build positive relationships with places like museums, libraries, and whatnot, the entities that aided in your research. These are people who will support your book when it's out. These are people who may offer to let you come and do lectures for them, so on and so forth. So these are very positive resources to have. And also, I know I've found some really great personal friends in these resources. So they're very, very advantageous to build that relationship. So now that you've finally been through the rejections and then you get your proposal accepted, what do you do? Now, many publishers will assign you a person called the acquisitions editor, who we mentioned a few minutes ago. Now, this is not the person who's actually going to be editing your book, but this is the person who acts as the go-between between you and the publishing house. So this is the person that you can bounce ideas off of in terms of how you may want to reformat your book or anything like that. This is also the person who is going to advocate for your book to the publishing house and then relay the publishing house's information, formats, whatnot to you. And this is the person whose big goal is to get your book on shelves and to make sure it makes money for the publisher. Um, this is also the person who's going to provide you with information like your deadlines, your publication date, how to turn your materials, and then the contract. You have to ask your acquisitions editor for something called the publisher's house style. So we'll talk more about that in a second, and how they expect your manuscript to be typed and formatted. It's always good to have that in advance so you don't have to go back through your whole manuscript and redo it for some reason. And then take a few minutes to celebrate because this is a magnanimous accomplishment getting signed to a publisher. So just take a few minutes because everything's about to happen very quickly. Okay, contracts. If this is your first publication, don't expect to have much of an ability to negotiate because you really don't have much to bring to the table other than I have this great story. But you have to remember some things like you don't become an author, especially in our genre, in order to make money. So you probably will not receive funding from the publisher for things like images, for things like research trips, anything like that. When I wrote my first book, I was still living in Maryland and had to come down to Hampton Roads quite frequently to do research. And that, any cost, the images I used, that was entirely on my own dime. And just don't expect to be reimbursed in any way for it. So royalties are usually low. This is why there are a lot of people who see self-publishing as more advantageous way to go because you can make more money that way. So for a first-time author, the average range is 8 to 10% of the gross profit. So to give you an idea, say your book costs $12 to publish. The publisher charges $24 for the book, so they're taking a profit of $12, of which you'll see about 96 cents per book sold at 8% royalty. That's my royalty on my first book. So needless to say, you're not going to make your money back that way. I personally make more money off of making sure I have a box of my books and taking them to my presentations and selling them there. I usually make about $5 to $6 per book sold that way. So it's a huge difference going that route. Also, going back to second bullet point, if you any expenses you have put into your work, save that receipt. You can write it off on your taxes, and that is very helpful. Anything from your gas to your mileage to any equipment you have to buy to your clothes if you're presenting, your makeup or whatever. These can all be written off on your taxes come tax season. I would recommend getting with a tax expert when you're doing that. So after you're looking at your royalties, you have to make sure there are certain things that are specified in your contract by the publisher. For instance, and this is one that a lot of publishers will try to leave out, you've put in there that they are responsible for sending out review copies of your book to newspapers and whatnot. Otherwise, they'll expect you to send the copies that are either your complimentary copies, which are maybe 5 to 10 of them, or send ones out that you personally paid for. So make sure that's specified in there. It's a hard lesson I had to learn. Also, the number of complimentary copies you'll receive. I like to, the resources that help me out a great deal, I like to give them copies of my book, or some other resources may require that in exchange for using things like imagery. So make sure you have that specified in there. You have to have some sort of flexibility with your deadlines. So you have to have, it in there that should the deadline need to be changed, it can be specified in there. Also, the number of images you might need to provide, the word count, that needs to be in there. And then I always recommend having a clause put in with the ability to renegotiate your contract after 5 years. Next year, I have my 5-year renegotiation for my first book. So that will be an interesting meeting, I'm sure. Again, you have to make sure you have clauses for specific things, like, for instance, clearly stating the publisher's intended distribution. When I signed my contract for my first book, it was at the time that the History Press was being absorbed into Arcadia Publishing. And so verbally, and I didn't have a recording of this, we were talking about distributing it across at least the East Coast and Barnes Noble, but that wasn't Arcadia's thing. They like to keep things local. And because I didn't have it written in my contract for them to do that, they were not obligated to do that. So it was a very limited scope as to where my books could be distributed to. And then do not sign any contract like anything else without reading it thoroughly. And remember, the publisher's point is to make money off of your work and your product, and no matter how passionate you are at it. So make sure, I hate to say it, you're getting your cut of it too. Now we're going to talk about the ever wonderful deadlines. Many publishers will give you deadlines that are different for the completion date of your work. So for instance, you're going to have a different deadline to say turn in imagery, to turn in your first draft, passing your proof pages and everything. So it's going to be a timeline of different things, and just make sure you can meet your deadlines, and make sure your contract clearly states it. And then you have to understand that deadlines can be flexible. So if you need more time, make sure you talk to your acquisitions editor well in advance. Like, don't contact them a week before your deadline and say, oh my gosh, I need more time. Just give them that idea, and they aren't obligated to uphold. They could say, sorry, tough toenails, you got to meet this deadline date. And then other things could happen with your deadlines, like the publishers may be forced to extend your release or your deadlines and whatnot. For instance, my book's coming out in August was originally supposed to come out in June. And because of the pandemic and everything being shut down, they had to push out that release date. So understand there's a flexibility in these deadlines, just not terribly much of one. Now we're going to circle back to the writings. I know it seems like we're talking about the business, and I'll tell you why in a second. Now make sure you familiarize yourself with the house style of the publisher. So they may require certain spacing, colors, fonts, etc. for their manuscript. And this is based on their pagination, or how they lay it out in their format. Like for instance, my publisher wants every paragraph indented only 3 spaces, not the tab button, using red for clearly seeing where you want the images to go, using certain font for titles, but a different one for the body, et cetera, et cetera. It's a lot easier to have that done before the manuscript is finished without having to go back and do it. I say that because I made that mistake. My first book, I wrote it completely in my own format, and then I had to spend a couple of weeks going back and retooling it. Now, you want your imagery that you submit to be high quality. A lot of this is because they have to look, if they publish it, as small or as big as they want. I recommend having images at least 600 pixels per inch. And then a lot of them will want it converted to TIFF. And then I put a URL down there if you want to write down to convert images from JPEG to TIFF. I have to admit to you, I am not the most technologically savvy person in the world. That's an understatement. My husband, fortunately, is, so he's been able to help me with some of this, trying to understand what all that means. I always say historically, historians are not very good at modern stuff. It's a joke. Now, once everything is turned in, you have to be prepared to start waiting. So then you get to editing your draft. And when you get your draft back from the actual editor, you have to be prepared for it to not look much like what you turned in. Some are a little bit more generous with their editing. I've been very fortunate with that. Others, not so much. So you have to be able to kind of take a beat, and try to understand why they made the changes they may have made. There are other things that may be part of the house style you may not necessarily agree with. I am a huge proponent of the Oxford comma, but my publisher is not. And I was able to slide a couple in there. They basically made me remove all the Oxford commas. And I'm a bit of a nitpicker, so that drove me a little crazy for a bit. And if they've changed aspects of your draft that you don't agree with, you stand your ground. Like if there are things that are very bluntly not reflective of you and your work and your research and your subject, go to your acquisitions editor if you have to try to get that retooled again. Now, be prepared to volley your drafts several times. My editor and I generally go back and forth at least 4 times, and just to kind of so we get on the same page, no pun intended, on how that final draft is going to look.
Nancy, we're quite a little bit over your time.
Okay.
Are there any things that we really need to just really quickly touch on to wrap
Oh
things
my gosh, I was running over. I didn't even realize that. I think the big thing is with authors is that when you're publishing, a very small part of what you do is the actual writing, but your writing needs to stand up on its own. The very last slide's a good one to put up, if that's
up?
okay.
Of course.
That way you can contact me and whatever, and if you want a PDF of this, I can send that to you. But that's a big part of the writing is the publishing, the marketing support and everything, and a very little bit is what you do, but you need to make sure that it stands on its own because that is your product. That's the big deal of it all. So make sure that you're willing to understand that, what you do is a small part of it, but yeah, so be proud of your work and make sure it's representational of you as a historian and as a person. And last slide, I think there should be one more in there, maybe. And this is how you can contact me. That's my website, my email address, my social media, my Twitter, and then all my book covers. So I apologize for running over. I wasn't looking at the time. So if you have any questions, just let me know.
There is one quick question
Okay.
from Pa Kofi. Do you recommend forming an LLC for payment and tax purposes?
I personally have not done that, but yes, it's very helpful to do that because there are also venues that you may sell your books at that may require that business license for you to participate there. Like for instance, a lot of book fairs or like if you do like a market or type of thing, they will want that LLC or that business license in place. It does make it easier for tax purposes. So thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Nancy.